In this video, you will learn how submitting forms really works and the different ways to do so. On one side, you have a form to collect data from the user. On the other side, you have a server to receive that data to process it. Since the server communicates with the client using the HTTP protocol, then the client can be anything. It can be a mobile app, a desktop app, or web app. Before submitting data, we first need to know what data the server expects to get and how it's formatted. There are three common encoding types for formatting data. The first one is URL encoded, and it's used for symbol text and formatted as key value pairs. The second one is multi-part form data, which is used to send binary data and text. You will need this when you want to upload files to the server. The third one is sending the data as JSON. Let's see an example for each one. The URL encoded type uses the query string format to add data. In this example, we have a key of username and the value is John Doe, and we can add more components using the ampersand. This is perfect when we want to send simple text values, but sometimes we want to upload files to the server. In this case, we should go with the multi-part form data. It's called multi-part because we can include multiple parts in each request payload, and each part can have its own content type. In this example, we have two parts. One sends text data to the server with the name of username and the value John Doe, and the other one is sending a file with binary data. You can see its name is picture, and it includes other information like the file name. The server can distinguish between different parts using boundary markers. You can, for example, see we have a boundary here for this part, and we have another boundary for the other part. This is usually used for uploading files since it allows us to send binary data. Most developers will be familiar with this encoding type as it's very common to send JSON data between the client and the server nowadays. So in this example, you can see we are sending the data as JSON. And it's best used when you have complex data structures, where data can be nested within other data. But remember, if you need to upload files, you still need to go with the multi-part form data encoding type. And actually, there is a way to send JSON data in the multi-part form data encoding type. Now the question is, where do we specify the encoding type? We can do that using the content type field in the request header. In this example, we are specifying that the request will include data as JSON. That's why we are specifying the content type as application JSON. But you can change it to whatever encoding type you want. Or if you are using the HTML form tag in the browser, you can use the enctype attribute like this. The default value is the URL encoded, but you can also switch it to multi-part form data. Unfortunately, there is no native support to send JSON data. In this case, we have to use JavaScript for that. Now let's jump to code to see how each type can be implemented. In this simple node project, I'm just serving a single HTML file called index.html. In that file, I'm just displaying a simple form that includes two fields, username and email. You can see that for the username, I'm using the username value in the name attribute and the email value for the name attribute for the other input. We need to add these attributes so the server can access them by name. Before submitting data, we have to specify three different values. The first one is the URL we are submitting to, and we can use the action attribute for that. In this example, we're gonna submit to the save endpoint, and we have to specify the request method. And for the first example, we're gonna use the get request. So let's say get. And this is the default value. And finally, we need to specify the encoding type, and we can do that using the enctype attribute. The default encoding type used in the form tag is the URL encoded, but let's be explicit here and use it here. Now let's go to the server to add this endpoint. For the sake of simplicity, we are getting the data and outputting them as JSON. But in real-world apps, you would usually validate the data, process it, and then maybe save it in the database. So in this example, you can see we are pulling the data using the request query object. This object parses the query string of the URL and split each key value pair into its own field. So you can see how we are accessing username and email off of that object. So let's test that. Now let's submit. Okay, that works as expected. Since it's using the get method request, you can see that the data is added to the URL here. And that's easy for Express to pull these data from that URL, and that's why we just needed to use the request query object. Now let's try this example, but using the post method request. Let's go to the HTML file and update this to post. If we test it now, in this case it wouldn't work because the server is still listening for get requests, whereas it should now be listening to post requests. So now let's go to the server to update it from get request to post, and let's test that. And again, this still will not work. And the reason for that is because we are getting the data from the query object, whereas it should be pulled from the body of the request. When you are sending a post request, the payload is added to the body of the request, not to the URL. So we need to tell our Node app to parse the body of our request using the URL encoded encoding type. The Express framework provides us with a middleware for that. So first, let's use that middleware, and you can see how it's using the URL encoded parser, but now the data is in the body of the request, so we need to replace that with body, and this with body. Now we can go back to the form to refill the information again, or we can simply reload the page. Cool, and that works. Now in our next example, we will upload a file. To upload the file, we need to change the encoding type to multipart form data type. And now let's add a file input for the file field. We will give it the name picture. If we reload, we would see the new file input added here. Now let's go to the server to update our save endpoint to make it work with this file input. Now we need to change the encoding type from URL encoded to multipart form data. Express doesn't support that out of the box. We need to install a third-party library, and it's called Multer. Just run npm install Multer. Now let's include the package here. In this example, we no longer need the URL encoded middleware, so we can delete that, and instead use Multer. Let's paste some code here first. Don't worry if this looks confusing to you, it's actually pretty simple once you understand it. Let's ignore this part first. All we need to do here is to tell our server how it should parse this request. And in Node you can specify a middleware for a specific endpoint in the second argument. In this case, let's say that this is the middleware, which is called upload. So if we just said upload, single, because it's a single file, and give it the name of the field, which is picture. So before this block of code is executed, this middleware will add the file information in request.file. For example, we can output the file name like this. So this takes care of reading the file information and outputting its name here. But we can use Multer to save the file on the server. And that's what code is for. So what we are saying here is that the destination for this file should be in the files directory, and we should use the same as the original name for the file. For that to work, we have to add the file directory here. And now let's reload, fill some test data, and let's upload some test file. Let's submit to see what we have. First, we can see that the new file field is added here with the name. And if you open up the directory under files, you will see the new file uploaded into this project. And if you go to the network tab in the DevTools, you can see how we are making a post request for this. If you click on save, you can see we are making a post request, and the content type is multipart form data. You can inspect the payload in details in the payload tab. You can see how we are sending these three fields. Two are texts and the last one is a binary. If you click on view source, you can see the full information, how each part includes its own information. We have three parts, one for username, the other one is for email, and the last one is for the picture field. Now before going to the JSON example, let's see how we can submit the same form but using JavaScript. This is good when you don't want to reload the page on submit and just do it on the client. So let's add some JavaScript. Let's get the form first. Now let's listen to the submit event. To prevent the form from reloading the page, we have to prevent the default behavior. And we can do that using event.preventDefault. Now let's get the values of each field. We can access each one on the form object, like so. So let's get first username. It's form.username.value. And now let's get the email. And let's get the file. For file inputs, we can access files using the files array. And let's get the first one. Now we can use the fetch API request for that. So we can say fetch, and let's use the save endpoint. Let's specify the method to post, and we want to add the values in the body of the request. Before sending the data, we need to package them in form data object. For that, we can use the form data API. So let's create form data, new form data. Now let's add each field using the append method. So let's say form data append, the name would be username, and the value would be username. We are getting the values from these variables. Now let's add the other ones, email and picture. Now let's add the body of the request and use the form data. Now before we test our work, we can actually remove everything from the form tag since we are sending everything from JavaScript. Now let's add some test data, and now let's submit the form to see what we'll have. Now if we open it, we can see how the request is sent like before, but now using JavaScript. Now the request method is post, and the content type is multi-part form data. Note how we get the multi-part form data encoding type even though we didn't specify it anywhere here. And that's the case because using the form data object automatically adds the multi-part form data encoding type to the request. Now if you go to the preview tab, you can see the data that the server responded with. So you can see we still have the email field, the file, and the username. So it works as expected. Now in our last example, we will send the data as JSON. Since the form tag doesn't support that natively, our only option is to use JavaScript. In this example, we don't need the file input anymore, so we can delete that. We can delete it from here as well, and we can remove the form data object. Now we need to specify the encoding type in the content type headers, and we can do that by specifying the headers object like so. Let's specify application JSON, and the body will be a stringified JSON object. So let's use a variable called JSON, and let's create it here. So let's say username, email. Since the body should be sent as string value, we have to stringify it using json.stringify. Now let's update the server to make it parse JSON data. So now we no longer need multer. We can delete this, and we can delete this middleware as well. And let's remove this field. Now in our last step, we need to add the ability for the server to parse JSON data, and we can use a middleware for that. And the Express framework already supports that. So we can use this middleware that knows how to parse JSON data. And the same, we can access the JSON data on the body object. Let's test that. Now let's submit, and we can see this new request. If we go to the headers tab, we can see that the content type is now using application JSON. And if we go to the preview tab, we can see now it works as expected. So this is how submitting JSON data works. But sometimes you want to send JSON data along with a file to upload. In that case, you still need to use multi-part form data, and you also still need to use the form data object. To show you a quick example, you will have this code. Now instead of sending each field individually, you will package these fields into a single JSON string, like this. And on the server, you still need to use the multer package like before, but now the difference is that we get the JSON data by parsing the body object on the request, and we can use it like this. That's it for this video. And now you know all the different ways you can submit forms in your web apps. If you have any questions, please leave them below in the comments section. I will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.